In the still hush of twilight, somewhere within the stone-framed simplicity of a medieval village, the air carries the scent of wood smoke, stale straw, and the faint musk of livestock. A chicken clucks indignantly near the hearth, while an old woman mutters a bedtime prayer, pulling a tattered blanket around her frail shoulders. This is not a romantic tale told in velvet, lit courts or castles. This is where most people truly lived. This is where love, desire, and intimacy quietly struggled to exist. Medieval intimacy wasn't something set against the luxurious backdrop of candle-lit chambers, silken sheets, or soft melodies drifting from a lute. No, those images belong to legend, fantasy, and later embellishments by poets and Victorian moralists, who never once had to share a straw mattress with 6 siblings and a pig. In reality, intimacy had to find space in a single room, barely larger than a modern kitchen, where daily life collided with sleep, meals, birth, death, and everything in between. The bedroom was a small nook by the fireplace, often just a pile of animal skins or a simple straw mattress. Nearby sat the cooking pots, a barrel of grain, and a squawking chicken whose judgmental eyes never looked away. If you were lucky, a crude curtain hung loosely from a beam, more symbolic than effective. Children snored against the walls, elderly relatives mumbled in their sleep, and goats sometimes nibbled at the corners of blankets. And yet, despite this chaos, human connection persisted. People whispered, touched hands beneath wool tunics, shared glances that said now or never, and moved carefully under the cover of darkness. Privacy wasn't granted, it was invented. For those wishing to steal a moment of closeness, everything became an orchestration, a quiet lull in conversation, a particularly loud windstorm that might mask sounds, or the rare moment when all other bodies in the room drifted into deep enough sleep not to notice movement under blankets. Even volume had to be strategic. One couldn't cry out or laugh too loudly. It was best to stifle everything behind tightly closed lips and silent prayers. Among the poorest families, love-making had to compete with hunger, fatigue, and the ever-watchful eye of community morality. In these villages, windows were small, walls thin, and gossip traveled faster than the plague. If someone heard anything, you could bet the entire parish would know by breakfast. Love became an art of timing, deception, and prayer. For those with slightly more means, artisans, merchants, or lower nobles, the situation improved marginally. Perhaps a separate room, maybe a servant to keep the children occupied. But even then, full privacy was rare. Servants might be present during bedtime rituals or share quarters nearby. In noble homes, the presence of attendants, ladies in waiting, and guards meant that only the most discreet could enjoy moments of intimacy without someone pretending not to listen behind a curtain. Even monasteries and abbeys, those havens of celibacy and devotion, couldn't entirely escape the pull of desire. Some abbeys were known for having unusually high garden walls, not for beauty, but to shield wandering eyes from curious visitors or scandalous behavior beneath the moon. And still the soul longed for connection. People wrote poetry, lovers carved initials into wooden beams, affection found its way into hand, sewn gifts, into loaves of warm bread, into stolen letters tucked behind pews in the village church. Marriage didn't guarantee privacy either. A couple might share their wedding night in the same room where 10 others snored, farted, and scratched lice in the dark. That intimacy could be observed, judged, or even supervised in more formal traditions. Some communities believed in bedding witnesses, where elders ensured the union was complete. Romance, as we imagine it today, was a flickering candle flame in the gale, force wind of medieval practicality. But even in this world of noise, scrutiny, and shared space, people still fell in love. They whispered dreams in the night, held each other close beneath ruffs, spun wool, and laughed softly when their feet tangled in the straw. Love made room for itself, even in crowded, stinking, chaotic corners of the world, and for a moment that fragile privacy, though brief, felt like a palace. Across the woven threads of medieval daily life, desire wasn't extinguished, it was reshaped. Bent beneath the weight of custom, superstition, and relentless eyes, people still nurtured tenderness in corners too humble for poetry. A glance across the table during supper could ignite days of longing. A fingertip brushing against another's palm while working the loom held more intensity than a troubadour's entire ballad. Love adapted, hidden in gestures, timed breaths, and the stillness between chores. In these crammed households, silence was a precious currency. If the children were finally asleep and the goats calm, one might lean in with nothing but breath and hope. The ache to be alone, even for a moment, pulsed like a second heartbeat. This ache wasn't always sexual. Sometimes it was simply the hunger for connection, a shared joke not overheard, a face turned toward you, not the fire or the pot of stew. Though the medieval mind saw the world through the eyes of faith, the human body remained undeniably human. Cravings were not vanquished by religious guilt or social shame. They merely dressed themselves differently. The church loomed like a parent at the door, whispering rules and pointing to calendars full of forbidden days. And yet, within these constraints, people did what they've always done. They negotiated. They rebelled, quietly, even as pulpits thundered that sex was for reproduction only. No joy, no pleasure. People whispered other truths. Women passed down herbs and tinctures to delay conception. Men learned when to pull away, when to linger. Grandmothers who remembered Roman tales knew plants that softened bodies and dreams alike. Lovers became alchemists, conjuring fleeting privacy out of candlelight and grace. The struggle wasn't just against physical limitation, but against the fear of discovery. To be caught in intimacy, especially outside the bounds of marriage, could cost a reputation, a dowry, even your place in the village. And still temptation hummed in dark corners. A barn, a field, the edge of a river, these were their sanctuaries. The flutter in the stomach when you caught someone's gaze at the market, the brief moment your hands brushed when offering a loaf of bread, these were their love letters. Among families, intimacy was sometimes a strategy. A woman, already with 5 children, might plead tiredness not out of rejection but sheer survival. A man might lie awake, not in frustration, but in guilt, wondering how to support another mouth. And in the rare cases when true desire aligned with opportunity, it was like finding gold buried beneath the mud of ordinary life. Noble homes had their own entanglements. Status did not buy freedom, it bought watchfulness. Servants, rivals, and scheming relatives turned every chamber into a stage. Lovers communicated with discreet tokens, embroidered initials, hand mirrors, or rings passed behind fans. Scandal was always one misstep away. Even affection between spouses, though expected, had to be tempered with decorum. A noble woman caught giggling in her lord's arms might be chided for impropriety. Too much affection suggested a lack of seriousness. Too little, and rumors of discord would rise. A delicate balance was necessary, and the emotional weight of that performance bore down on hearts longing simply to love and be loved freely. There were moments of rebellion, too. A couple might steal away from a feast to meet behind the stables. A maid might leave the window cracked so her sweetheart could whisper up from the garden below. These weren't just acts of desire, they were acts of resistance. Resistance against a world that told them their bodies weren't theirs, their time wasn't theirs, their love had to serve something greater than joy, and yet joy found them in quiet laughter, in shared wine. In the comfort of someone pulling the lice comb through your hair gently after a long day. Desire might be muffled, but affection rang clear in the gestures between people who saw each other not as roles, husband, wife, daughter, but as souls passing in the same storm. What we now view as oppressive, they navigated with innovation. The lack of privacy taught them to speak without words. The constant presence of others made brief togetherness feel monumental, and the tightrope between shame and expression created rituals of closeness that we've nearly forgotten. The warmth of kneading dough together in silence, the strength of working side by side in the fields, the electricity of helping lace a tunic before Mass. In these small acts, love survived, and so, within smoky rooms filled with breath and bread, between sleeping children and the creak of timbers, two people might find themselves close enough for a moment to forget the world. No silks, no musicians, just wool, firelight, and a hope that no one stirred. It began with a bell, not just the sound that called villagers to prayer, but the sound that echoed deep into their beds, their marriages, and their very desires. In the medieval world, the church was not merely a building or a Sunday obligation. It was the architecture of everyday life. Its teachings infused meals, marriages, and especially what happened behind closed curtains, if there were curtains at all. Sex, the church taught, was not for comfort, closeness, or even love. It was for one purpose only, procreation, creating more souls for God. Everything else, pleasure, laughter in the sheets, or any spark of delight, was treated with suspicion. At best, it was a distraction. At worst, a sin. People absorbed this belief not through scripture alone, but through sermons that thundered down from wooden pulpits, through whispers in confession booths, and through stories shared in hushed tones around the hearth. To desire one's spouse too much was dangerous. To seek comfort in touch was indulgent. Saints were celibate. Martyrs were pure. Heaven was for those who could tame the flesh, and that taming began with knowing when not to touch, not to crave, not to want. But what truly caged people's bodies was the calendar. The sacred calendar wasn't just a list of feast days and fasts. It was a labyrinth of forbidden nights. Sundays, no, that was the Lord's Day. Fridays, also no reserved for penance. Wednesdays, suspicious. Then came Lent, 40 days of reflection. Advent, 40 more days of spiritual preparation. Certain feast days, saint days, moon phases, and holy vigils added more red lines to the calendar, until entire seasons became deserts of physical abstinence. A couple could look at each other with longing and then sigh, knowing tonight was yet another no. If they gave in, they might feel joy for a moment, but then came guilt, confession, and sometimes penance. For the faithful, even marriage offered no full sanctuary. Moderation was the mandate. A priest might recommend that a married couple only come together once a month, in darkness, without laughter, and preferably without much enjoyment. There were lists, literal lists, etched in ink on parchment or passed along verbally, spelling out all the days when intimacy was forbidden. It became less a relationship between two people and more of a tightrope walked under the watchful eyes of saints and angels. Some took these rules seriously, perhaps too seriously. There are confessional records of entire villages obsessed with small acts, a couple holding hands, a stolen kiss in a field, someone being seen leaving another's home after dusk. It didn't take much to rouse suspicion, and once suspicion took root, shame followed. Young couples felt torn between desire and duty. Some prayed for their urges to pass. Others gave in and then wept afterward, convinced they had endangered their soul. Marriage itself was seen not as a union of love but a compromise, an allowance to help people avoid worse sins. It is better to marry than to burn, the scripture said, and many took it literally, yet people still yearned. They wanted to feel warmth, affection, and closeness, not just perform duty, and so they learned to live with contradiction. They made love on borderline days, lit candles with half closed windows, and bargained with their conscience in the soft dark of the night. Priests, too, were human. Some offered compassion in confession, others scorn. A merciful priest might assign only a prayer and a moment of silence. A stricter one might demand days of fasting or a public apology. This inconsistency only deepened the fear. What was allowed, what was too much, and so a strange emotional landscape formed, one where love walked hand in hand with guilt, where married couples kissed each other cautiously, where even laughter in bed might draw internal alarm, and where the calendar hung beside the hearth became less a timekeeper and more a spiritual gatekeeper. Still, amid all this, people found ways to bend without breaking. They memorized loopholes, they justified joy on birthdays or anniversaries, they snuck in touches while baking bread or harvesting grain, and when their children were finally asleep and the moon offered privacy, they let themselves be human, even if only for a few minutes. Because love, even when burdened by doctrine, still found a way. In time, the sacred calendar came to be read not just with reverence, but with a weary kind of calculation. Couples became mathematicians of abstinence, silently counting days between holy prohibitions, searching for windows of permissible affection. To love someone in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of the heart, it was a battle with time itself. And yet, not every couple felt guilt in the same way. Some carried the Church's warnings like stones in their chest, heavy, inescapable, shaping every breath. Others tucked the rules into the same mental drawer as taxes and weather, something to consider, but not to let ruin everything. These quiet rebels were not heretics. They were simply people who valued tenderness too much to let it rot under fear. They didn't talk back to priests, but they did ignore them politely. A wife might nod solemnly as the friar preached moderation, only to slip beneath the blanket that night with her hand already reaching. A husband might confess, then commit the same sin the next week, convinced God would forgive the sincerity, not the schedule. It was the balance between piety and pulse that defined much of medieval married life. There were, of course, those who took the rules to heart with relentless devotion. Newlyweds, especially, often tried to adhere strictly to church teachings. Some even slept apart during Advent and Lent, even when no one was watching. For them, desire was a dangerous fire, one that needed to be buried beneath layers of humility and prayer. But even among the devout, frustration bloomed. A young woman, told to serve her husband but not enjoy him, might feel her soul fraying. A man, drawn to his wife but terrified of sin, might find himself confessing more often than communing. There were tears shed in silence. And sometimes, in extreme cases, despair. The Church, for all its rules, offered few tools to navigate that pain. Celibacy was elevated, marriage was tolerated, passion that was almost always suspect. Saints were described as untouched, pure, untempted. Nowhere in their stories was there room for the earthy, messy beauty of shared life. The ideal Christian was, frankly, someone who barely touched another person at all. And yet stories persisted, quiet, underground, told in whispers. a friar who once loved a woman before his vows, a noblewoman who wrote secret letters to her husband while he was away at war. These tales were not sermon-worthy, but they survived because they felt true. Children, too, watched and learned. From a young age, they saw how their parents navigated affection. Some homes were cold, disciplined, dutiful. Others had moments of warmth, gentle touches while stirring soup, laughter during evening prayers. What the church condemned, children sometimes recognized as love. And then there were the clergy themselves. Monks and priests who took vows of chastity often wrestled with their own desires. The temptation wasn't always carnal. Sometimes it was longing for closeness, for conversation, for someone to know them beyond their title. Letters written between monks in far monasteries speak of affection, of loneliness, of love dressed in theological robes. It's not that these men failed their vows, it's that they, too, were human. Women in convents formed intense relationships as well, bonds forged in shared prayer, shared silence, and sometimes shared longing. Modern readers debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But what is clear is this: even in the most sacred places, hearts beat fast when touched. The boundary between spiritual and emotional intimacy blurred often. One could write a psalm to Christ and sound like a love letter. One could praise a saint and speak of beauty with trembling hands. Emotion found its way through every crack, even when the rules tried to seal them shut. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a world where people tried. They tried to be good, to honor God, to obey the church, but they also tried to love well, with honesty, with presence, with as much joy as they dared. And sometimes those two paths crossed gently. Other times they collided. A couple might rise from Mass, hand in hand, full of resolve to abstain. But later that night, when the wind howled and the fire burned low, they would turn to each other not as sinners, but as companions. Flesh pressed against flesh, not out of rebellion, but out of comfort. The body was not wicked, it was weary, and love was not lust, it was refuge. That kind of love, quiet, defiant, deeply human, survived despite centuries of caution. It pulsed in kitchens, whispered in gardens, lingered between hay bales and beneath woolen cloaks. It looked up at the stars and dared to ask, can God be found here too? And maybe he could, maybe not in every touch, but in the intention. In the care, in the devotion one gave not just in prayer, but in presence, because in a world where so much was denied, the act of holding someone tightly was nothing short of sacred. In the medieval world, love was not the architect of marriage, land was. Lineage was, legacy was. The union of two souls was too fragile a reason to bind families. What mattered was property, alliances, and the quiet certainty of a well-calculated match. A father didn't ask his daughter whom she loved. He asked which union would bring more wheat, more cattle, or more proximity to power. Marriage began long before the couple met. In many cases it was discussed over tankards of ale between fathers, or whispered by noble mothers while walking through herb gardens. The children, if they were old enough to be considered that, were consulted only once the terms were clear. By then, love had little room to breathe. To many, this was normal, expected. A son was a name, carrier and inheritor. His wife would produce heirs, manage the household, and serve her husband's name more than her own happiness. A daughter was a token of goodwill or a means of reaching further up the social ladder. Her womb was part of the negotiation. Her silence was a virtue. Some matches worked. Affection, surprisingly, often bloomed after the vows. Two strangers could become friends, even lovers, with time. A man might discover in his wife a fierce wit that made the hearth warm. A woman might find in her husband a gentleness that no one had told her to expect. These were quiet blessings, not often discussed, but deeply felt when they came. But many marriages were colder. a husband more interested in the estate than the woman beside him, a wife who smiled in public but wept when alone. They did their duties, raised their children, hosted feasts, and prayed, but their bodies moved around each other like shadows that never touched. Loneliness lived even in the grandest halls. For noble women, especially, marriage was a gilded cage. Her clothes were fine, her table full, but her freedom was rationed. She was watched by servants, by other noble families, by her husband's allies. Letters were intercepted, glances were judged, and if she ever sought affection elsewhere, it could cost her everything. Adultery was not merely immoral, it was political. It jeopardized inheritance, threatened alliances, and stained names. Men, by contrast, had more leeway. A nobleman might keep a mistress, provided he did so discreetly. He might spend his nights in the arms of a serving girl, and still be praised for fathering strong sons. His wife, meanwhile, was expected to remain dignified, fertile, and silent. Love was not her right. It was a possible luxury, one she might find in the spaces between duties, but never in defiance of them. In villages, the pattern repeated itself on a smaller scale. Marriages were still arranged, though not with parchment and seals, but with handshakes and debts forgiven. A farmer might offer his daughter to the son of a neighbor who owned more fields. A cooper might marry his child to the bakers for easier access to grain. Affection was hoped for, but never required, and yet feelings didn't vanish. Young hearts still beat fast. A girl might long for the boy who gave her wildflowers behind the chapel, not the one her father favored for owning 2 oxen. A boy might dream of the girl with dark eyes from the next village, even as he watched another being led toward him in a bridal veil. Some fought. A few eloped, running to other towns where no one knew their names. Others resisted quietly, delaying marriages, feigning illness, asking to enter a convent or a monastery. But these were dangerous acts. Defiance brought shame. Shame brought punishment. For women especially, refusal was nearly impossible. To say no was to challenge the structure of the family. A disobedient daughter reflected poorly on her entire bloodline. So many nodded their heads, even as their eyes flooded with tears, and walked forward into lives they did not choose. Within those marriages, some found little corners of joy, a shared love for music, a child they both adored, a habit of walking at sunset in companionable silence. These became threads that softened the edges of arrangement. People learned to survive. Sometimes they learned to care. Others found escape in stories, tales of lovers who defied the world, of knights who chose a peasant girl for love, not rank, of women who wept not because they were trapped, but because they were brave. These stories traveled from hearth to hearth, embroidered into tapestries, whispered by wet nurses, written between the lines of saints' tales. Such myths didn't change reality, but they reminded people that love, real love, still mattered. Even if it lived outside the walls, they were told to stay within. In time, many came to see marriage as an act of endurance. It wasn't about romance. It was about lasting. A successful marriage was one where no scandal emerged, where children were born in the right sequence, where the house ran without too many raised voices. Stability, not joy, was the prize. To love within those lines was a kind of bonus, welcome but never guaranteed. Still, something in the human spirit pushed against resignation. A young wife married at 14 might find brief delight in embroidery circles, where women whispered stories of what could have been. They didn't always name names, but everyone knew the tone, the longing hidden beneath a well-practiced smile. A husband, tied to a woman he barely knew, might discover solace in music, or in long hunting trips where no one asked questions. He might look at his wife and think, she deserves better, but say nothing. Regret sat in the throat like a prayer never spoken. Even when passion was absent, companionship could grow. Shared grief often bound people closer than shared pleasure. The death of a child, a poor harvest, a mother's illness, these moments cracked open even the most formal marriages. Hands touched, tears were wiped, words came slower but with more weight, and sometimes, from that pain, something tender bloomed. Yet beneath all this, beneath the compromises and the small mercies, lurked a quiet ache. What if marriage could have been about love from the start? Some people dared to pursue that dream, and their stories still echo. There was the knight who rejected a politically advantageous match and married a washerwoman. His lands were reduced. His title lost its gleam, but he wrote poems about her feet in the river, about her laughter echoing off stone walls. Some mocked him, others envied him. There was the nun who left her convent and ran away with the falconer. They were hunted, excommunicated, and eventually vanished into legend. In their wake were only whispers, some of shame, some of admiration. There was the young widow who chose not to remarry despite pressure from every direction. She lived alone, managed her own land, raised her children with help from neighbors, and refused every offer. "I've loved once," she said, "that will be enough." And there were countless others, lovers separated by duty, reunited by chance, or forever waiting on opposite sides of a river they were never allowed to cross. Their stories, unlike the saints, were rarely written down, but they survived, stitched into quilts, painted into margins, passed down like heirlooms of the heart. For most, though, rebellion wasn't possible. So they found their own small ways to assert themselves. A woman might name her child after the boy she once loved. A man might plant his wife's favorite herbs outside the window, even if he never said why. An old couple, having long since moved past resentment, might sit quietly beside each other, grateful for the kind of closeness that came not from fire but from weathering years together. Sometimes love did arrive, late, awkward, unexpected. A pair married for status might discover, in middle age, that they missed each other's company during long absences, that they liked the way the other stirred soup or prayed before bed. It wasn't the love of bards and ballads, but it was theirs. Still, for every quiet peace, there were also loud sorrows. A wife who was never kissed with affection, a husband who always slept with his back turned, a pair who shared a house but not a life. And beneath it all, an entire system that chose alliances over hearts, legacy over happiness, and control over choice. But even in that world, love found cracks. It bloomed like weeds between paving stones. Stubborn, uninvited, beautiful, it came in glances across banquet halls, in fingers brushing during Mass, in letters hidden under floorboards. It came, and it made people brave, brave enough to dream, to want to remember, and that, more than any arranged contract or dowry ledger, was what made marriage something more than a transaction. It was the possibility that, even amid duty, love might still find a way. Desire, in the medieval world, was a double-edged flame. To feel it was human. To act on it, however, was often to invite judgment, punishment, or worse. The Church had carved narrow paths for intimacy, strict, sanctified, scheduled. But people were not stone. Their bodies whispered in the night, in chapels, in markets, in meadows. They longed, even when they prayed not to, and so a shadow world bloomed alongside the sanctioned one. A world of secret glances, lingering touches, and words laced with intent. This world did not belong to saints. It belonged to the bold, the desperate, and the enchanted. The idea of love magic was not born from fantasy, but from hunger, for control, for attention, for hope. A lonely girl might go to a wise woman and ask for something to make a boy look at her differently. A heartbroken widow might whisper the name of the man she desired into a cup of wine, Spells weren't seen as illusions, they were seen as chances. Some of these magic acts were rituals with real emotional power. A locket buried beneath moonlight, a lock of hair sewn into a pillow, a prayer spoken backward. Whether they worked or not was less important than what they symbolized: defiance. In a world where women especially had so little say, these acts were small rebellions, private declarations that love should not only be endured, it should be claimed. For every village there was a woman whispered about, the herb, seller, the bone, reader, the crone who knew things. She might live in a moss-covered hut at the forest's edge or dwell among townsfolk, unassuming. She was sought not for sin, but for answers, and many who came to her weren't witches or heathens. They were mothers. Sons, servants, knights, people tired of waiting for love to come politely. Seduction, too, had its own language. It wasn't just bodily, it was embroidered into gestures, how a woman let her veil slip just a bit lower near a certain man. How a merchant's daughter lingered in the marketplace, pretending to admire apples while her eyes flicked toward the stable boy. Words were rarely spoken plainly, they didn't need to be. Want was a current just beneath the surface, dragging souls into quiet storms. Not everyone approved, of course. The church warned against any form of attraction outside marriage, and especially against manipulation through charms. To use love magic was to mock divine will. To seduce was to risk one's soul. But for many, these were warnings they had already internalized and chosen to challenge. Noble courts were ripe with such tension. Ladies in waiting learned the game early, how to be clever, lovely, and dangerous all at once. Courtly love, for all its ideals, was filled with intrigue. A knight might write poems to his lord's wife. A duchess might meet a poet in the library's back hall. The danger only heightened the thrill. These were not always sordid affairs. Sometimes they were deeply emotional, even spiritual. A love that could never be fully touched was often the most consuming. Some preferred it that way, the ache more powerful than the act. And when acts did happen, when lips met, when clothes were loosened, there was always a risk, not just of eternal damnation, but of very real consequences: pregnancy, banishment, shame, even death. A scullery maid who tempted the steward might find herself dismissed. A priest who strayed could lose his parish. A woman who dared to love below her station could vanish from dinner conversation forever. Yet, despite all this, the pull remained. It was in the blood, in the moonlight. In the way music drifted through the courtyard at night, the seduced were not always innocent. Some knew exactly what they wanted. A barmaid who slipped an extra measure of honey into a patron's ale. A washerman who pressed a bit too close as he handed back a noble's linens. Their actions weren't accidents. They were choices, risky, calculated, full of nerve. Desire, when denied too long, became resourceful. And when it couldn't be expressed in action, it found form in art. Songs, riddles, and carvings told of love unspoken and lust unfulfilled. One could find a heart carved into a chapel bench, initials hidden beneath the altar cloth. Even illuminated manuscripts, those holy, ornate books, sometimes held in their margins tiny drawings of lovers kissing, as if the scribes themselves couldn't quite silence their yearning. In this way, seduction became legacy. Even in monasteries, where vows of celibacy and devotion were sacred, the body did not always obey the soul. A young novice might find himself distracted not by theological riddles, but by the curve of another's smile. A nun might press her fingers too long on the chalice she passed to a visiting monk. These were not sins born of wickedness. They were the quiet, human remnants of longing. Some resisted, wrestling their urges through fasting, prayer, or labor. Others fell In rare moments, two souls might connect in secret beneath the chapel stairs in the dark of confessionals. Their acts, cloaked in guilt and wonder, were both sacred and profane. And when it was over, they would whisper apologies not just to God, but to themselves, for feeling more alive in that transgression than in all their piety combined. Of course, there were those who used desire as currency. Not everyone who seduced did so out of love. A cunning courtier might play on a young knight's affection to gather secrets. A noble widow might entertain suitors not for passion, but to solidify her power. These seductions were more dangerous because they mixed lust with politics, a potent and sometimes lethal combination. But just as often, seduction came from loneliness, not strategy. A shepherdess who spent her days in isolation might welcome the advances of a pilgrim passing through. A blacksmith's daughter might fall for a scribe who smiled at her once in the rain. They weren't planning revolutions. They were simply reaching for warmth. Those who practiced love magic often paid the highest price. The church was relentless in rooting out what it saw as heresy. A woman found with strange herbs or unfamiliar chants could be accused of witchcraft, especially if someone's affections changed suddenly. Trials were brutal. Confessions were extracted through threats or worse, yet the need persisted. Love magic, in many ways, was not about control. It was about desperation, a woman unloved by her husband, a man unnoticed by the woman he saw each day. People turned to spells not because they were wicked, but because they felt invisible. If they could not be chosen naturally, they would try to bend fate. Some of the rituals bordered on poetry, whispering a beloved's name into a well, sleeping with a mirror under the pillow to dream of a future spouse, walking backward through the woods while clutching rosemary. These acts were not always sinister. They were hopeful, childlike, and in some odd way sacred. The church never fully understood that. It saw only rebellion. But to those who used charms, it was about restoration, of dignity, of agency, of belief that love was not just for the lucky or the highborn. Even priests sometimes turned a blind eye. Not all clergy were harsh. Some, having loved once themselves, understood. They might scold gently, warn about hell, but offer no real punishment. Quiet tolerance thrived in many parishes, hidden behind incense and scripture. Still, not all tales ended gently. A young girl caught sneaking into a knight's quarters might be beaten or wed off quickly to avoid scandal. A boy who flirted too openly with a merchant's wife could be sent off to war. A scribe who wrote too many love letters might find himself reassigned to colder, harsher lands. Desire, when made visible, was dangerous, and yet, perhaps more than anything else in the medieval world, it made people feel alive. In its most honest form, seduction wasn't about lust or conquest. It was about recognition. To be desired meant being seen. To be longed for meant mattering, if only for a moment. A married woman whose husband never touched her might find that single gaze from a stranger more powerful than a decade of quiet dinners. A cloistered man might feel a brush of fingers and question everything he thought was true. These encounters, whether fleeting or lasting, could change lives. Some left everything behind. A noble who ran off with a handmaid. A monk who abandoned his post to live as a farmer beside the woman he'd once only glimpsed. Most didn't end happily. Poverty, isolation, and regret followed, but still, they chose, others stayed. They buried their feelings beneath duty. They kissed their spouses each night, and never once whispered the name they thought of as they fell asleep. They raised families, they aged, they were praised for their composure, but deep down, in some quiet place within them, a part always remembered the one they didn't choose. Or couldn't. And so, in every castle, village, and monastery, desire lived on, not just as sin or weakness, but as proof that even in a world of rules, the heart still beat wildly. The image of the medieval knight glows with impossible shine, armor polished like a mirror, banners rippling in the wind, eyes burning with purpose. Tales painted them as paragons of loyalty, protectors of the weak, and faithful lovers of unreachable ladies. But the real world beneath the gleaming veneer was bloodier, lonelier, and often more human than any troubadour's ballad. From a young age, boys born into the knightly class were told their duty, to fight, to serve, to love from afar. Chivalry was not just a code, it was a myth etched into bone. They were taught to revere their lords, their lands, their faith, and above all, to revere the lady, even if she was never theirs. Courtly love, as it came to be known, was built on yearning. It celebrated the love of a knight for a noble lady, usually married, usually untouchable. He would perform deeds in her name, carry her token on the battlefield, compose verses for her beauty. It was devotion without consummation, service without reward. To outsiders, this seemed tragic, but to knights, it was a form of sacred suffering. To love without possession elevated the soul, or so they believed. In truth, not all knights were so noble. Some treated love like conquest. A favor from a lady was a prize. A stolen kiss was proof of prowess. Yet the idea of pure, unfulfilled love persisted. Many believed in it fiercely. Some even died for it. There were stories told by firelight of knights who rode for days to see the lady they adored, only to glimpse her from a distance and ride away again, satisfied by that single moment. Of men who refused marriage because their heart belonged to someone they could never have. Others lived these stories without glory. A young squire might fall for his lord's wife. She might speak gently to him once, smile as he brought her wine, and that would be enough to haunt his dreams for years. He would fight harder in tournaments, hoping she noticed, and when he saw her with her husband, he would burn quietly, knowing that love was not always reciprocal nor fair. Knights returning from war carried more than wounds. They brought silence, trauma, the distant looks of men who had seen too much. Some had ridden into battle clutching a token from their beloved, a ribbon, a brooch, a scrap of cloth. Some returned to find the lady had married another. Others came back only to be forgotten. The ideal of knightly love demanded suffering, but real love, real grief, came with messier scars. A knight might wed out of duty, not passion. His heart could still be tethered to the one he left behind on campaign. And even if she had never returned his love, he'd remember her every time his wife sang out of tune, or when the wind caught a strand of golden hair just right. Some women played the role of the beloved lady with care. They knew the power of admiration. A glance, a word, a glove dropped intentionally. It could inspire a poem or a battle cry. And in a world where women had little political sway, being a muse was a form of influence. Others hated it. They didn't want to be put on pedestals by men who didn't know them. Love me as a person, they'd whisper in private, not as an ideal, but those whispers were rarely heard. Beneath the ideals of chivalry were cracks. A knight might vow loyalty to one lady while keeping a mistress in the village. He might speak of purity while siring bastards. He might kill in the name of honor, and yet be incapable of kindness to the woman who bore his children. War made hypocrites of many. It took the tender hearts of pages and made them killers. It twisted love into absence, the knight's absence from home, the absence of touch, of words, of softness. Letters sent months too late. Graves never found, a widow's hand slowly forgetting the weight of his. Yet still, in some hearts, chivalry meant something. A knight would go without sleep to protect a woman from danger, even if he did not love her. He would ride across rivers to return a dropped necklace. He would bow before an enemy if she asked him to spare a life. These moments were rare, but when they came, they were written down, not just in ink, but in memory. The battlefield did not care for poetry. Knights who once recited verses beneath castle balconies found themselves knee-deep in blood, screaming prayers not to saints, but to the faces they had left behind. It was not the code of chivalry that saved them in those moments. It was memory, a hand once held, a scarf once tied around the hilt of a sword, a song sung softly by firelight. When death stared close, love was not a distant lady or a gilded icon. It was the ache in the gut to return home. It was the desperate need to not be forgotten. Some nights perished with names on their lips, names no one recognized. Letters found in satchels bore the ink of longing. My dearest Elinor, or to the lady I will never touch again, unsent, undelivered, torn by the elements or by time, the survivors were not always whole. Many returned missing more than limbs. They had left behind pieces of themselves, on the battlefield, yes, but also in the longing they could no longer articulate. A knight who had once sung about the stars now stared at his ceiling each night in silence. Those who had worshipped noble ladies from afar sometimes came home to find them married, their glances dulled by years and duty. What had once been sacred now felt faded. A love sustained only in imagination could not always endure the weight of reality. Some knights dared to pursue their long-beloveds anyway. They asked quietly if their feelings had ever been returned. Some women said yes, too late. Others wept for the things they might have said had time been kinder. A few simply turned away, unable to reconcile the man before them with the boy who once wrote of moonlight and lilies. Courtly love, for all its elegance, was often a ghost. More honest were the relationships forged not in ballads but in hardship. A knight who took shelter in a peasant's barn during a storm might meet a widow who fed him broth and asked no questions. He might return to that village a year later and find her still waiting. There was no poetry in such bonds, but there was tenderness, realness, hands calloused by work, arms that held without performance. Still, the knight would always feel torn. The code demanded something loftier. He was supposed to belong to a lady of grace, not to a woman who smelled of bread and wood smoke. He might love her in silence, never naming her when speaking of devotion, and she, in turn, might watch him ride away, knowing he would only ever half belong to her. The heart in a knight was a divided thing. Many knights found themselves envying the very peasants they had once been taught to pity. For all their lack of status, peasants loved more simply. There was no pageantry, no need for riddles. A man saw a woman, offered her his coat, and walked beside her home. There was no need to win her favor through song or arms. He simply needed to show up. Chivalry, by contrast, demanded performance. Even when knights truly felt love, they were expected to disguise it, turn it into acts of glory, wrap it in layers of symbolism. A rose on a helm, a dance in the Queen's hall, every touch veiled in metaphor. It made love feel beautiful, but also distant. Some knights grew weary of this, older ones especially. Men who had once carved poems into their swords now said little. They had seen too many loves lost to politics, distance, or silence. They now believed in presence over poetry. Love her, one grizzled warrior told a squire once, and say so, don't wait for a war to prove it. But the young still believed in the ideal. They tied tokens to their spears, they whispered sonnets before battle, and sometimes, miraculously, those gestures mattered. A woman might wait for a knight to return not because he promised riches, but because he gave her a pressed flower and meant it. A noble lady might choose the quiet knight with honest eyes over the boastful one with 1,000 victories. Sometimes love pierced through performance. Still, it was rare. For most, love remained tangled with expectation. A knight must serve, suffer, and suppress, and if he ever broke, if he ever cried out for love that could not be, he did so behind closed doors, with his armor set carefully beside him, like a second skin he was learning to remove. The cloister was meant to be a haven, stone walls high and impenetrable, silence kept like scripture, souls drawn inward, away from the desires of the world. Here, monks and nuns were not men and women, but servants of God, clean, distant, serene. But they were still flesh, within abbey halls, beneath arched ceilings painted with saints and gold, human hearts still beat. Not every prayer cleansed away desire, some only buried it deeper. Many came to monastic life not from calling, but from necessity. A third son with no inheritance, a daughter considered unmarriageable, a noble family eager to cleanse scandal with holy placement, and sometimes someone running from heartbreak. Not all who wore robes did so willingly. Among them walked the truly devout, those who believed in celibacy as transcendence, who found ecstasy in isolation, but beside them walked others whose longing had only shifted shape. Their love was no longer tied to kisses or letters, but to looks across cloister gardens. A glance shared during morning psalms, the touch of hands exchanging chalices during Mass. A novice might study under an older monk whose voice, gentle and firm, stirred something he didn't understand. A sister might weep in confession, not for sins committed, but for feelings she couldn't name aloud. The mind prayed, but the body remembered. There were rules, of course, harsh ones. Any known affair between clergy was punished swiftly. Removal, shaming, inquisitions if necessary, but the Church's iron grasp could not bind the human heart. In remote priories, love grew in silence. A sister might tend the herb garden with a monk, their conversations always veiled, always cautious. But their hands would brush over rosemary, and later that night each would lie awake, remembering not the words spoken, but the warmth of that contact. There were even those who wrote, pages passed in secret, Latin psalms reworded into verse. Blessed art thou among women. A monk might whisper, quoting scripture, but thinking only of her. Some acts were never spoken of. A stolen moment in the sacristy, a kiss shared behind the apse while bells rang out to drown the sound of breath. It was dangerous, it was sacred, it was human. There were those who gave in once and then spent years repenting, and those who never acted but burned inwardly each day, convinced that feeling such hunger made them unworthy to wear the cloth. Yet in some places quiet acceptance thrived. An abbot might look the other way if two novices seemed unusually close, so long as their duties were fulfilled. A prioress might counsel love with compassion, not judgment, saying softly, even the saints were tempted, be kind to yourself. Still the price was high. A nun found with child faced exile or worse. A priest caught visiting a lover's chamber might be reassigned to distant, desolate places, far from warmth, far from mercy, and yet it kept happening. Because love, in its purest form, seeks out even the most fortified of hearts. To a monk who had known nothing but silence, her laughter could sound like revelation. To a nun who had lived in prayer, the softness of his eyes could seem like grace. Some even believed that such love was not a sin at all, but a form of divine testing, that God placed these desires within them not to shame, but to refine, that resisting was noble, but understanding was holier still. Others felt differently. To them, love within the Church was betrayal, a breaking of vow, a threat to purity. They condemned such feelings in others and themselves. They fasted, wept, flagellated, trying to cleanse themselves through pain. But guilt only grew sharper when love was real. It was easy to scorn lust, harder to condemn tenderness, and hardest of all when love made them better, not worse, more patient, more humble, more compassionate. Then the question haunted them, how could something so condemned bring so much light? Within abbey walls, not all stories of love ended in ruin. There were those who chose faith over feeling and lived quietly, never confessing the depth of what they carried. A sister who tended the infirmary might watch over a wounded brother from another monastery. She'd sponge his forehead, change his bandages, whisper prayers over his sleep. And when he left, she'd kneel for hours in the chapel, not to ask for forgiveness, but to thank God she had known kindness, if only once. Some monks, old and near death, confessed love in their final hours, not of women, but of other men. Not lust, not scandal, but a brotherhood that had deepened beyond friendship. I never told him, one said with tears in his beard, but I loved him as the sun loves the sea, always near, never able to touch. There were also stories of women who gave up their vows, left the cloister, and dared to live for love. Not all were shamed. Some were welcomed into village life, took husbands or wives, raised children with gentleness carved by prayer. And when they spoke of their time in the convent, it was not with bitterness, but with gratitude. There I learned to listen. One woman said, so I could finally hear my own heart, not all clergy loved each other. Some loved people on the outside, pilgrims, confessors, even those they ministered to. These were the most dangerous loves of all, power and vulnerability intertwined. A friar might grow too close to a penitent woman, first in compassion, then in comfort. She would come each week, sit with bowed head, and he would say all the right things, but feel all the wrong ones. He would return to his cell, clutching the rosary until his knuckles paled, whispering her name between Hail Marys. A nun might help teach children in the village, and find herself drawn to a mother whose laughter brought light into her darkness. She'd brush their hands by accident, and feel warmth rise like a psalm. And later she'd write in her journal, I have not sinned. I have only noticed beauty and been humbled by it. Some churches were harder than others. There were orders where kindness was crushed, where love, any love, was seen as poison. Monks whipped themselves for impure thoughts. Nuns were punished for smiling too long at visiting priests. These places became prisons of the soul. In such places, love did not die, it twisted, but in gentler convents, in more merciful priories, love transformed instead of corrupted. A brother might teach a sister to illuminate manuscripts, their fingers brushing as they shared pigments. Together they'd paint saints whose eyes looked suspiciously like hers, halos gleaming in gold leaf. They never spoke of what they felt. They didn't need to. The love lived in the silence between brushstrokes. Some clergymen tried to preach against it. Desire is the devil, they'd say. Temptation is sin's handmaiden. But others, the wiser ones, said simply, love is not the sin. It's what you do with it that matters. This perspective saved many hearts, for those who could not leave, could not confess, could not act. Love became a quiet light, a secret kindness carried like a relic, not defiling their faith, but deepening it, giving them reason to pray more gently, to forgive more swiftly, to live not in spite of desire, but alongside it. There were even saints, whispered of in corners, who had known forbidden love. Some believed St. Bernard had once wept for a fellow monk. Others said Hildegard of Bingen's visions came from a kind of sacred longing. Whether true or not, these stories gave hope, proof that love and holiness need not be enemies. Still, the church was not built on stories. It was built on rules. Many lovers were discovered, letters intercepted, eyes watched. One novice was found at midnight near the vestry with ink-stained hands and trembling lips. He was sent away without trial. His companion, a quiet older monk, was demoted and never allowed to preach again. They never saw each other after that, but the older monk continued to leave a sprig of lavender on the altar each midsummer, long after everyone had forgotten why. In the world beyond the cloisters and castles, women carved their stories not with swords or scrolls, but with glances, whispers, and wounds carried in silence. Love for them was rarely safe and almost never simple. A queen did not marry for love. She was bartered, positioned, weighed against alliances. Her wedding gown was sewn with politics, her kiss sealed treaties. Yet behind jeweled veils and practiced smiles, queens often found their hearts elsewhere, in the arms of poets, guardsmen, or in dreams they could never speak aloud. Some queens wielded this carefully. They turned affection into advantage. A well-timed favor to a knight who loved her could sway the course of war. A poem written by candlelight and secretly passed beneath her chamber door could become a weapon if read aloud in the right hall. She knew the power of being adored and used it like a blade behind silk, but love did not always favor the mighty. In villages far from courtly halls, peasant girls risked everything for love. They met in barns and by wells, under moonlight or in haystacks. A glance from the wrong man could endanger everything. A child out of wedlock was not a romantic tragedy. It was starvation, banishment, branding. Still they loved. A weaver's daughter waited each day for the young cooper who delivered barrels, brushing their hands each week as payment passed. A shepherdess left flowers on a soldier's path, never speaking a word, just watching him walk away again and again. Midwives, often older women with sharp eyes and stronger hands, became keepers of secrets. They knew whose belly had quickened before marriage. They whispered herbs into pots, brewed infusions that silenced scandal. Some said they practiced magic. Most simply knew the cost of love too well to judge it. But the line between healer and heretic was thin. A woman who knew too much, spoke too freely, or lived without a man might soon find herself called witch, and love, especially a forbidden one, was often the match that lit the pyre. Many such women had simply dared to choose their own path, a widow who took a younger lover, a healer who refused a lord's advances, a girl who ran into the woods and did not return alone. They said it was potions, enchantment. In truth, it was often just love, dangerous because it was free. Not all were punished, though. Some found happiness quietly. A brewer's daughter married the stable boy she'd loved since childhood. They lived in a thatched house with 3 children and a cat, and every evening he brought her wildflowers with muddy boots. It wasn't poetry, but it was love, and sometimes love meant protection. A noblewoman might shelter her maid who'd fallen pregnant, claiming the child as her own bastard nephew. A village crone might lie to the priest to shield a pair of young lovers hiding in the forest chapel. They risked everything not because they condoned the love, but because they remembered their own, and some women, gifted or cursed, fell in love with ghosts. They lit candles for men lost to war. They wore tokens for lovers who'd vanished on crusade. They sang lullabies to children who never lived. Their love lingered like fog, shapeless, endless, wrapped in loss. Yet even this was a form of survival. For a woman, love was rarely indulgent. It was work. Risk wore in its own right, but sometimes it triumphed. A woman named Usibit was born to a miller and grew among flour sacks and water wheels. She laughed often and sang while carrying grain, but when a traveling knight came through her village, her life unraveled like spindle, thread. He kissed her under the apple trees, promised to return, then vanished into war. When her belly swelled, the village whispered. Her father turned his back. She gave birth alone on straw, helped only by the village midwife who'd once lost a child of her own. Usabet named her daughter Aline and raised her by weaving, mending, cleaning. whatever coin she could earn. She never cursed the knight. He gave me her, she said. What else do I need? A line grew, bright-eyed and sharp-tongued. She asked about her father, and her mother simply said, he was kind for a season. That was enough. Aline became a midwife herself, skilled with both herbs and secrets. She learned to help women without judgment. Love doesn't always arrive clean, she said, but it always leaves something behind. Some called her a witch, others called her a miracle. Then there was Lady Morel of Evreux. She had been married at 14 to a duke 3 times her age. She bore him 4 children and buried 2. Her husband took mistresses freely. Morel kept her silence, offering prayers and tending to orphans. But at 36 she met a painter, a man sent to illuminate the family's ancestral book of hours. He came with ink-stained hands and a voice like velvet, quoting verses as he worked. She visited the scriptorium daily under the pretense of piety, but soon she brought him cakes, and he painted her into a page, disguised as a saint, haloed in gold. Their love was never consummated. They never touched. Yet when the duke found the manuscript and recognized her face, he banished the painter and burned the page. Morel wept not for herself, but for the image. It was the only time I was seen, she said. Some women wielded love like a torch. Thessaly the Black, a so-called witch of the northern marshes, was said to enchant men with her voice. In truth, she healed the sick and took no lovers, though many offered. One day she nursed a wounded guard back to health. He fell in love with her, utterly and without hope. When he confessed, she wept and kissed his forehead. I love you too, she said, but love is not enough to keep me caged. She gave him a bundle of herbs for his journey, and he left with a heart fuller than it had ever been. Years later, they said her cottage burned with her inside. Others claimed she had turned into a raven and flown away. But among the ashes, they found a perfectly preserved page from a missal, and on it a line inked in careful hand. Let love be the fire, not the chains. In cities, love shaped rebellion. A merchant's daughter named Roisette dressed as a boy to study medicine, falling in love with another student who never knew her truth. When they finally kissed, she told him, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "You loved me when it was dangerous. I will love you when it's safe." They married in secret, lived in disguise, and saved hundreds with their practice. And sometimes love was revenge. A betrayed wife once wrote letters to her husband's mistress, not angry ones, not jealous ones, letters of warning. He will make you feel like a queen, she wrote, until he makes you feel like dust. The mistress left him, and the wife never remarried. Instead, she opened a school for girls. From the highest towers to the lowest fields, women turned love into freedom, pain into wisdom, silence into story. They were never saints, but they were never just sinners either. They were women, and they loved. Love in the time of war was always written in ash. When cities burned and men marched beneath banners they barely believed in, love became a stolen thing, stolen kisses behind tents, names scratched into sword hilts, whispered prayers from one dying mouth to another. It did not wear perfume or lace. It smelled of blood, wet earth, and hope. In a small garrison near the Breton coast, a soldier named Thomas carried a folded cloth in his armor, a scarf belonging to a baker's apprentice who had once brought him honey cakes and laughter. They had spent only 3 nights together before Thomas was conscripted. The boy kissed his forehead the morning he left and said, "You won't die. I forbid it." Thomas smiled through tears and made no promises. Years passed, battles blurred, men fell. Thomas survived. He grew harder, colder, but the scarf remained threadbare, faded but sacred. He never saw the boy again. But in every moment before battle, he pressed the cloth to his lips and remembered what it meant to be loved before he became a ghost with a sword. Sometimes love meant survival or surrender. During a siege, a young woman named Elise climbed the city walls nightly to meet a soldier from the enemy camp. They never spoke aloud, only touched and passed notes written in charcoal. He smuggled bread. She brought clean bandages. When the city finally fell, Elise was found by her neighbors, held at knife point. "She's a traitor," they screamed, but the soldier, now part of the occupying guard, stepped forward and said, "She is the reason half your children lived." He did not claim her as lover. Only as mercy. That was enough. She was spared. He was reassigned. They never met again. But years later, she named her son after him, not for love, but for honor. Then there was the famine, the great starving. When the crops died and the fields turned gray with rot, love became rationed like flour. Families tore themselves apart. Parents gave the last crust to one child and watched the others fade. But in a cottage deep in the mountains, an old woman and her wife survived by sharing everything. One boiled root between them each day, water cupped in a single hand. They sang lullabies not to children, but to each other. "We've seen everything," the older one said. "This too will pass." It didn't. The younger woman died in the spring thaw. The old woman buried her beside a tree they'd planted 50 years before. She marked the grave with a spoon and a braid of dried lavender. When asked by villagers how she had endured, she said, "I remembered how she loved me when I had nothing, so I gave her everything. Even in sickness, love stood like a candle against the dark." In a leper colony, a woman named Myra tended to a man whose face had all but vanished. She wore gloves, veils, said nothing of beauty. Each day she fed him, washed his wounds, read him psalms. After months, he began to hum when she entered the room. Once he said, "If I had known love could be this quiet, I might not have chased it so loud before." He died in winter. She buried him with flowers she had dried in the eaves of the chapel. Then she went back inside to care for the next soul, and the next. She never married. She never told anyone what that season had meant to her. But every year on the day of his death, she placed a wooden spoon with a carved heart under the chapel altar. No one knew what it meant. She did. In the village of Martal, Sarui, there lived a woman named Nomi, who had once been a maid in a great noble house. She had never married, but kept a tin box under her bed with a single lock of golden hair, a withered corsage, and a letter signed only for N. When asked, she would smile and say, "A ghost gave me those." In her final years, she sat each day on her porch with a wool blanket over her knees, telling children stories, some true, others stitched together with memory and dream. But one tale she always told the same way. "There was a man who taught me to read." She'd say when I wasn't supposed to, he'd sneak me psalms on scraps of paper hidden in bread. I learned every word because I loved him. He left one day and never came back, but he gave me something more precious than a kiss. He gave me myself. The children didn't understand it. Not really, but they grew quiet every time she told it. Years later, when Nomi passed, the village priest found that tin box. He buried it with her, unopened. Some memories, he said, were meat.